Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War News Update, first part there for the 20th of July 2024. I'm going to have to completely re-record this video. I did it hours and hours ago, but YouTube didn't like it and problems, etc, etc. Okay, so it's been a fairly typical day considering the last few days in terms of losses. 990 personnel lost, just a tad below 1,000, so still a very high number, but lower than we have seen. 7 tanks, which is a snip below the daily average. 15 armoured personnel vehicles, likewise. 22 artillery systems, one of the lowest numbers we've seen in that category for some time, but still above the daily average for the war, and still really significant for the Russians. 1 multiple launch rocket system, 1 anti-aircraft warfare system. I have to see what they are as the dust settles. 59 vehicles and fuel tanks and 14 pieces of special equipment. So some high numbers in a few of these categories, and even like 990 is a really high number, even though we're used to a range from about 1,100 to 1,300. Just because it's low, just below 1,000 doesn't mean it's not a problem. But I think the heat is going to be playing a large part in why we have seen possibly less activity. Now, I know some people might argue that you're not going to be failing to order your troops to do X, Y, and Z just because it's hot. But actually, we've got record-breaking temperatures. And if you've seen inside some of these tanks where some of them don't have air conditioning, modern tanks do have air conditioning, but some of the older tanks will just have a little fan, and you can't move. You're absolutely covered with, I guess, old school electronics and mechanics, and the diesel engine chucking out all sorts of heat and fumes, and it's going to be really horrible. You know, you think about a cat on a hot tin roof. Well, you can fry eggs on top of tanks, and think about being inside them in those kind of temperatures. So I think there will be a slight lack of activity due to the temperature. When we look at Andrew Perpetua's list, and this is from yesterday, he said it's a rejigged one, and I don't think it's the one that I showed yesterday that has been rejigged, that you got wrong or had a couple of errors. But anyway, it's about 1.5 times the equipment Russian losses compared to Ukrainian losses. We'll look at the Ukrainian losses, and actually when considering the combat assets that have been lost for the Ukrainians, there's definitely a better ratio of losses for the Russians, as in, well, better for the Ukrainians, higher Russian ratio loss for the combat assets than just sort of 1.5. So the Ukrainians lost electronic warfare, bit of kit, damage, don't know what it is. A P-18 radar, that's going to hurt a little bit. And we've got an unmanned sea drone, probably the one caught attacking the Crimean area, the Coast Guard base around there. Some boats and a jet ski for the Ukrainians, and then some artillery systems, some tanks and IFVs, and MRAP and an APC. None of them particularly high value. It's all going to be painful for the Ukrainians to lose, but got some unknown tanks there, T-64, BMP-1s and 2s. M113, so nothing too crazy. And the proportion of damage to destroyed for the Ukrainians in the combat losses is not as bad here as it is for the Russians. So quite a lot of Russian losses. And outside of artillery, you look at the IFVs and the APCs, a lot more abandoned and destroyed. Slightly better for the artillery and tank losses. Okay, for the Russians here, electronic warfare equipment damaged, likewise, and the recovery of vehicle damage as well. Artillery being destroyed and damaged are D30s, but then a few other ones too. We'll talk a little bit about types of equipment we're seeing and stockpiles in a second. Tanks, T72 modified in 2022, so there's interesting range here. T64, a T62 modified in 1975, and a few other unknown tanks there, and a list of BMP 1s, 2s and 3s for the infantry fighting vehicle losses. And that's quite a fair number of tanks and IFVs lost by the Russians there, a couple of APCs. Trucks, civilian vehicles and ATVs, a couple of quads there to add to the list. So quite a long list of Russian losses, quite a few Ukrainian losses thrown in there, but I think the Russians will rue those losses more than the Ukrainians, but it would be nice to see a larger loss of Russian equipment there. Now, here's something from War Translator. I won't read out the whole anecdote to you, but warriors of the 1307th Russian Regiment say that old, untrained Russians often come to serve in their rank. Many come simply to die at a higher cost, while others are forced by their wives. They say at least you will be of some use. Somehow it doesn't fit with the picture of an incredibly motivated army that some are trying to paint. And talking about personnel, we've had Estonia's intelligence, according to Colonel Ants Kiviselg, Estonia's military intelligence chief, quote, in recent months, Russian forces have lost an average of 1,000 soldiers per day. But, quote, the amount of people that Russia is ready to lose at the front is significant. So, yep, they're prepared to lose a lot, but they are losing a lot. 1,000 a day is broadly what the general staff figures from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense themselves claim. Now, what that means is that I've been spending 2 years presenting evidence to you that appears to suggest that the Ukrainian general staff figures are somewhat correct, somewhat accurate. All these other data points, like the BBC Russia and Mediazona investigation that has shown the number of Russian soldiers from that have been claimed to, the number of Russian soldiers whereby their obituaries and announcements of their deaths have been put on social media that have been 100% connected to the war, like they've died in the war for sure. Really high threshold to that. Don't include LPR and DPR. That's shown significant numbers of people having died. Then you have the payments out to families that indicate that Russians have lost huge numbers of people in the war in Ukraine. Then you have the number of amputees and disabled people that have absolutely skyrocketed over the course of the war. Then you look at the visually confirmed evidence that we have. You look at the anecdotes across the course of the war coming out from social media where Russian soldiers said X, Y, and Z. Then you look at intelligence conclusions here from Estonia. Then we had UK intelligence, as here, Estonia's estimate of Russian killed, says Shashank Joshi, and wounded daily, 1,000 men, is pretty much in line with the UK's publicly claimed figures, which is in line pretty much with the French publicly claimed figures, which is there or thereabouts with the Americans. So you've got this situation where everyone is agreeing that the Russians really are actually losing this many people, or, even if it's not quite the amount that they have claimed, it's somewhere near there. This isn't out the realms of plausibility. And so we are, I think, justified in believing what the general staff are claiming, where we're not justified in believing what the Russian MOD are claiming through outlets like TASS that are just completely fanciful and actually physically impossible. But the question is, as ever, what are the Ukrainian losses compared to the Russian losses? And we just don't know, right? We can have a stab at it. There is supposedly another Su-25 jet that was lost yesterday in Donetsk region, possibly the Prokrovsk direction. So that's another loss for the Russians that will hurt them. Now we're going to go to Richard Vrecker from War Spotting, who had I read to you most of an article from The Economist yesterday that was discussing his findings and others. So Vrecker says the Economist magazine has published an article about Russia running out low on equipment. To my surprise, they mentioned me as an open source analyst, so I thought I'd do a thread on it. The main thrust of the article is about the Russian stocks of stored equipment that being deep but not bottomless, and I agree with that sentiment. I'll go further to say that some of the best equipment is near the end of stored equipment. First, I'm going to look at IFV and APC numbers, and here I can... Why does it do that? Here I can recommend a Google sheet made available by John P, and I've looked at that before, who's done the counting. Overall, Russia has removed more than 6,756 pieces, and that's more than it has left in working condition. But you might argue, yeah, that's being a bit over halfway, as he says here, may not seem... Oh, it's so frustrating. May not seem good, but if you look at the numbers, some equipment is almost all gone. MTLBs in particular, these have been heavily used on the front line. Equipment like BRDM 2s and BTR 60s and 70s still have a lot left, but little of this old stuff is used on the front line. And the most important of the IFVs and APCs are the BMPs, which you will see sit in the middle of the pack when it comes to how much has been taken from storage. But if we look at what John P has counted in more detail, we see the remaining 1,382 usable BMPs. Most of them, about 893 of those, are the oldest BMP-1s, and about 650 are specialist artillery support vehicles. So it's hard to be totally confident with satellite photos, but perhaps only a few dozen BMP-2s or later are left. In other words, you've got BMP-1s, 2s and 3s. BMP-3s basically constructed at about, as he goes on to say actually, I've created a chart of the percentage of each type of BMP lost each month, and the BMP-3 is still in production at about 140 made last year, and the BMP-2s have been the most numerous, at least if you take the losses as a proxy for use, so the amount that they lose or the amount that they use. Don't worry too much about July 2024. We don't have a full month's worth of data, but for almost a year, the share of BMP-2s has been increasing. That's this yellow area, perhaps because they have been prioritizing getting them out of storage. If they are now gone, that matters. It's also possible that Russia has been importing BMP-2s, but I won't go down that rabbit hole. Okay, just summarizing that. So you have a big bunch of, say, BMPs left that you might look quite impressive, but most of those are actually ones that you would use for artillery support. So they're actually not really IFVs, they're support vehicles, and that's why there's quite a lot of them left, or they are going to be in usable condition but less usable than previous ones that you've got out of storage, because you take out the ones that require the least amount of work. So you get to this point, and I talked about this earlier, where BMP ones that were most easily buffable were taken out, and BMP2s, and then you would see a lot, because there were a lot of BMP1s, you could get a lot of those out of storage. But then it gets to the point where the BMP1s and BMP2s are both needing huge amounts of work to restore them to use to a level where you can use them on the front lines. So if you're going to put, say, a week's worth of work into a BMP1 and a week's worth of work into a BMP2, you're going to do that to the BMP2 because it's better and newer. So you got to a point where the BMP1s left are in... You can fix them up, but you might as well fix up the BMP2. So you're going to see more BMP2s, but then you're going to get to a point where those get exhausted, and then you're going to go back into the BMP1s. But of those BMP1s, many of those are support vehicles. And so actually, although the numbers of vehicles might look like there's still a long way to go for the Russians, I don't think that's the case. And that's kind of what he's saying here, as well as the idea that with each successive week, the ones that are left are going to require more and more work doing to them. So it is not a good situation for the Russians. Next, I'll look at tanks. And he, of course, talks about the video from Koba Kabal that is on YouTube, and he's done a count there. That counting effort produced these numbers, showing that over half of the total remains, but most of the best tanks are gone. All of the T-90s have gone, 3/4 of the T-80s, and over half of the most modern T-72s. They used a slightly different way to grade the condition of these tanks, but again, most of the tanks in decent condition have gone, and most that remain are in poor or worse condition. In other words, they still might have a number of tanks left, but it's going to take a lot of time, effort, and money to get those up to scratch. Now we will come to artillery. This table is 6 months old and shows what's been taken: 5,525 towed guns, 1,489 SPGs, so a lot more than towed. Overall, it's less than half, but look at the pattern. Some types have hardly been touched, like the M46 130mm. It's a really old gun, and of course, you're not going to take that until you really desperately need to. And the fact that you are now starting to see those means that you are desperate, right? While others, like the 2A36, is over 3/4 gone, it's also harder to assess the condition of guns from satellite photos. So that you are now starting to see M46 and old D10s, D20s and D30s means that the better SPGs and newer guns, even if there are some left of those, are almost certainly going to be in dodgy condition. And typically that's just flying all over the shop at the moment, this Twitter thread. In The Economist article, it quotes my theory, that some of the towed guns have been removed to remove their barrels to working self-propelled guns, which I say based on loss patterns, here again from War Spotting, showing many more self-propelled guns than towed guns have been visually confirmed as lost. This is only a theory. It's possible that self-propelled guns are easier to spot, hit and photograph because they are generally bigger than towed guns, and the visually confirmed losses may not match the proportions on the battlefield. Throughout the war, the losses of artillery reported by the AFU have been much higher than the confirmed losses, and the difference is much more stark than with tanks and IFVs. But as a proportion of losses are not changing much, it would suggest that barrel swapping might be happening, at least with some types. And I've talked about this before, that there's a big difference between the general staff figures and, say, Andrew Perpetua's loss stats on artillery, because actually you're not surveying satellite imagery that's 20, 30 kilometers behind the front lines. You're not having so much drone footage, 20 plus kilometers behind the front lines. Sometimes artillery is spotted, but if it's counter battery fire that's taking out the artillery, then you're less likely to have that recognized by drone footage, so on and so forth. So there will be a difference between the claims of the general staff and the confirmed losses that we see from open source and intelligence sources. So the article also mentioned ammunition, and I think it's most likely the overall limiting factor on artillery, not barrels. And I partly say that looking at the loss patterns, again, Russia brought some calibers back into service, like the 240mm S2 S4 and the 152 Giant when they still had a standard 152mm gun left. I think this was to use up that ammunition, and I think their recent decline is indicative of that ammunition now coming to an end. So they've found big stockpiles of ammunition that's particular to a certain caliber of gun. So they've jigged, or they refurbished those guns until they used up that ammunition stockpile that they had, and now they're going back to their sort of typical gun calibers and ammunition. So Russia started with about 14 to 18 million artillery shells in storage. They've been firing constantly over 20,000 a day, up to 60,000 a day, which uses up a lot, especially when you maybe add 1 million shells lost in ammunition explosions. The article states Russia can now make about 2 million a year. That's about 5,500 shells a day, close to 5,000 that Russia fires on a typical day. There are so many claims. Thierry sent me some info that it's back to 9-to-1 ratio, where the Russians are firing 9 times what the Ukrainians are. I think it really depends where you are on the front line, what the situation is at any given point of the month. So have you just had some deliveries from the Czech initiative? Are you waiting for them to come in? So I'm sure there's just all these ups and downs throughout the month that makes it very difficult to give you a definite ratio that's going to be consistently correct between a ratio of Russian artillery fire to Ukrainian artillery fire. Russia imported a lot of shells from North Korea that were in very bad shape late last year. Firing poor quality shells uses up barrel life with a low probability of a hit. So I think that Russia would only have used them if their principal limiting factor was barrels. Multiple launch rocket systems are another type of artillery that John P has done a count of in storage, showing 3/4 and 2/3 of the main two types of gun have gone. So quite high amounts there. It's possible that MLRS will be another pinch point if the quoted numbers of new rockets are accurate, but not yet. So those are your multiple launch rocket system losses. Pre-war and the reduction, so 23% remaining for BM21s. That's a really difficult number. 40%, 39% of BM27. So yeah, some heavy hits on multiple launch rocket systems there. When counting equipment from satellite photos, it requires there to be photographs, and with some of the bases, the photographs are quite old. Generally, this will mean more equipment has been taken than realized in the overall numbers. It's also possible that some of the equipment left is either in better or in worse condition than it seems from the photos. You can't always tell. So I reckon this is probably going to be absolute best case scenario, mainly because the satellite images are old. There have been people claiming that Russia is about to run out of equipment since day 2 of the war, and they were wrong. However, I come back to the point from the start. Russia's store of equipment is deep, but not bottomless. We don't truly know how close to the end we are, but for some significant types at least it might be close. So to finish off, this is some speculation from him. The right way to fight Russia is not to try to fight them to the end of an attritional war where Russia pulls every last thing from storage and imports what it can. This very much trickle provision, drip feed of equipment to Ukraine. So they are attriting Russia in the long term, and it's just it's a big war of attrition. The West, he says, should give a surge of equipment and ammunition now in one big wave, so it lets Ukraine win a decisive victory, a victory for themselves, for liberalism, democracy and freedom, that ring around the world for all to hear. So yeah, absolutely. And just along the line of this being a situation whereby the Russians are fielding suboptimal equipment, Trentelenko says the Russians are running short of traverse and elevation gear for T-80s 125mm guns now. I can understand why you build turtle tanks based on old tank models, T-62s and T-54s, for example, tanks with broken turrets, or even T-72s or T-80s of older modifications, which are brought straight out of storage and not modernized on factories. But here in this picture, we see a T-80 BVM modernized in 2022, one of the most modern tanks in the Russian inventory, converted into a turtle tank. So why is that? Why would you do that? Can't you repair those T-80s? Then that's an issue. It is not a good look for Russia if they are turning some of their newest tanks into turtle tanks that can't really turn their turrets or easily fire their barrels. Incredible. Now here we have some footage that's doing the rounds of a Russian attack in Uruzhaina area, and this is basically a cavalry charge, modern cavalry, where we have motorcycles, motorbikes, and a whole host of them traveling from one part of the battlefront to another to do an attack. As mentioned, this is supposedly near Uruzhaina. There could be this situation, I've talked to you a lot about this previously, whereby Russians are being forced to use suboptimal equipment, but in using them find out that they do have some advantages. So like I've said before, 20 people on top of 20 different pieces of kit, motorbikes here, are harder to hit than 20 people on an IFE or in an IFE. You take that IFE out, you take all those 20 people out, arguably. But 20 people on motorcycles are less likely to trigger mines and more difficult to hit with one shell or one ATGM or so on and so forth. So actually there can be some advantages to the situation whereby they've been forced to use motorbikes more frequently. Russians note issues in drone production. For one Russian FPV, there are up to 10 Ukrainian ones, and you can read the anecdote here. Ukraine has overcome the shortage shortage thanks to its own developments and the help of its allies. They note the lack of drones similar to the Baba Yaga, octocopters, hexacopters, vampire drones, things like that, which cause enormous inconvenience. So this anecdote here, again, I'm not going to read it, but you can read that at your own leisure and see what you think. Definitely something we're hearing more and more of from the Russians is that the Ukrainians are outproducing them in terms of drones. And here we have another fire in Russia, this time in the Moscow area at motor oil production plant. Really big fire there. That's where is it? Taldom in Moscow region. Now we're going to go on to distance strikes, and overnight Ukrainian air defense shot down 12 out of 16 drones. The interception rates that they give are, I think, the way I understand it, is that these are ones they actually shoot down out of the skies. Some of them that come down from electronic warfare or disappear from radar are included as kind of ones that get through. So sometimes we've had, like, say, 12 out of 16 drones shot down, but all 16 failed to get to their target. I don't know whether that's the case last night, but just to let you know, it doesn't always mean that the remaining ones are damaging their intended targets. 1 out of 1 reconnaissance drone, then 0 out of 1 Iskander-K and 3 Iskander-M missiles. So all those Iskanders got through. I don't know where they hit, don't know what damage they've done other than possibly to an energy facility in Sumy Oblast. Russian forces launched an attack against Sumy Oblast overnight, damaging an energy facility there. We've had the Russians targeting a railroad in Kharkiv Oblast last night, injuring 4 Ukrainians and taking out buildings and rolling stock, or damaging them. Due to the strikes, the network of the outskirts of Kharkiv was damaged. Trains operating between Kyiv and Kharkiv had to wait for repairs. Traffic resumed at night. Trains heading to the capital, the intercity train to Kramatorsk, was also delayed. So I don't know whether that's taking out rolling stock that was carrying mechanized equipment maybe, or whether that was striking just rail infrastructure in general. Now, then the biggest problem yesterday for the Ukrainians was a horrific strike in Mykolaiv. At least 3 people, I think that's 5 people now, have died as a result of the missile attack, which witnesses say hit a normal backyard. It says here 10-year-old, but I think it's a 12-year-old boy. So Tim White described this as another described the 12-year-old boy as being blown to pieces as he tried to run up the garden path to a shelter. That may sound like horrific language, but I think we've got to say things how they really are here. A boy was blown to pieces as civilian infrastructure was hit. Zelensky himself said a Russian missile strike on Mykolaiv hit a children's playground near an ordinary residential house. Currently, 5 people are reported injured and 3 people killed. As I mentioned, that's up to 5, I think now, including a child. My deepest condolences to the families and friends who have lost their loved ones. Every day, Russia proves with its terror that there's not enough pressure on it. This destruction of life must be stopped. We need new measures to support our defense. Russia must feel the power of the world. Now, yesterday, Andrew Perpetua on his live stream did a section on places that were struck along the front line, and there were a lot of strikes along the Ukrainian front line. The Russians have been shelling and hitting an awful lot of civilian infrastructure. An awful lot of places are having an absolutely horrific time. Mykolaiv is one out of many. There were S-300s thrown, I think, into places in the Kherson region, as well as up along the Donetsk and Luhansk front lines as well. It is the Russians seem to have really stepped up what appears to be fairly indiscriminate shelling and bombing and rocket attacks and missile attacks on the Ukrainians there. That's that dancing child. He was into traditional Ukrainian dancing. His name was Kirill Dyadyushka. He was 12, and he's now no longer alive as a result of what the Russians did yesterday. Now, the biggest piece of news for the Ukrainians was this strike on Milerovo Air Base last night that took place. Now, I went to bed thinking, as I do, this is how sad I am, thinking if I was Zelensky or Sursky, what would I do? And I was going to come down and speak about, surely this is going to happen at some point. I'm not saying this was a result of that, but I think, so the Western nations like the US have said you can't use our or allied equipment, it seems, munitions to strike air bases into in Russia to take out these planes that are dropping these guided glide bombs. And since the guided glide bombs and the cruise missiles are the biggest threat to, and these ballistic missiles dropped from planes are the biggest threat to Ukraine, the number one objective for Ukraine should be to take out those air bases. And if they can't do it with those missiles, then they need to do it with their own indigenous stuff, and they need to do it as soon as possible. Now, we've been hearing that Ukraine is producing attack drones at the rate that Russia are, and yet unless some of these facilities have been struck by Russian missiles, and we don't know. So, for example, 4 Iskanders got through last night. Did they hit attack drone manufacturing facility somewhere in Ukraine? I don't know. But you would expect Ukraine to be able to produce a large number of drones. Now, we saw some of these waves sometime back in a couple of attacks on Novorossiysk and other areas that night, where we had an awful lot of drones suddenly hit. And then it goes quiet. And a bit like what the Russians do is they don't have enough to do this all the time. So you're stockpiling and you do these big waves. These big waves have to now be at Russian air bases. So you can expect big waves of drone attacks on Russian air bases. And Milerovo was hit in Rostov, which is interestingly not as far as Belbek. And yet you're not allowed to hit this with Western weapons. And yet you can hit Belbek in Crimea, even though Russia say Crimea is part of Russia. And so there's no difference between hitting an airbase in Crimea and hitting an airbase in Rostov. Oblast. And yet for the Americans, it seems that is the case. Anyway, 16 explosions were heard at this airbase, multiple fires at different places on the airbase. There's another one there, to the point where, Jakub Janovsky is saying that all people watching this war must be thinking about hardened aircraft shelters for their air bases, because drones are a big problem in the war. And Russians have complained about this for a long, long time, that why are we not protecting our aircraft? Firms data is showing that there are some big fires at this airbase, particularly near the airstrip. And exactly what Special Kherson says is what I said just before, that the Milarovo airfield is located 20 kilometers from the border with Ukraine, which guarantees complete safety from Western weapons systems, despite the fact that it's located relatively close to the front line, 150 kilometers. So that's 150 kilometers. Belbek Air Base is even further, which is 230 kilometers, and yet you can hit that with ATACMS, and you can't hit that airbase with ATACMS, and it's closer. It's just absolutely bonkers, isn't it? Here we have PS01 saying fires were recorded in the area of the runway and the parking lots for the aircraft. Possible that aircraft might have been taken out. Su-30 SM have been seen parked at that part of the runway, but it's also fairly close to oil depot at the airfield, which is going to be supplying those planes. And of course, if you take that out, then you can't use that as a forward operating base for your planes. You can't refuel them, and so that would be very, very much a key target for the Ukrainians there. There's also another huge fire here. I don't know if this is the same fire that we saw earlier in my other segment, but Moscow oil infrastructure is having a rough day, says Jay in Kiev. Either another piece of oil infrastructure has been hit, or that's a different view from the same one from earlier, Tambol or wherever it was. Right, we're now going to go on to the strike from yesterday, different air base. If you remember, Luhansk Oblast, or near Luhansk city, I think, was hit. Remains of a Ukrainian MGM-140 ATACMS tactical ballistic missile motor lies in a field after dispensing nearly 1,000 bomblets over Russian target of Luhansk city airfield, and some more evidence of that munition. NASA's FIRMS fire monitoring system confirmed a fire in the vicinity of that airfield, and you can see video evidence of something in smoke there at the time. Here we have another source saying update on yesterday's Airview ATACMS strike. It looks like it could have taken out a Russian S-300 VM air defense system. Based on the location of the fire shown on the NASA FIRMS imagery, which can be off some, it is becoming more likely that the AFU struck launchers and probably radar and command vehicles, of a Russian S-300 VM anti-ballistic missile air defense battery believed to have been deployed there. We need to wait for satellite imagery to confirm that, but that could be really good news for the Ukrainians. Likewise, there's good news coming out from the maritime drone strikes on the Coast Guard base, but also further inland as well. So high-resolution satellite images showing the aftermath of the Ukrainian naval drone attack on the Russian military base in Novoozerne, Donoslav Lake in occupied Crimea. Comparison of July the 19th, July 19th and July the 4th images here. So we have scorch marks, so that's the base, and then we have inside further inland. So we have the base getting scorched and those boats appearing to be taken out. So if we now pause it there, so that's the base as it would normally look. And then are these, have these all caught fire, those ships? If we look just before it, do the ships look in better condition, better color? I don't know that you can work that out from that, but that has certainly been hit. And then here we have the scorch marks at the Coast Guard facility or the naval base or whatever it is. And then inland, so obviously there's an aerial drone that has done the damage there. So a number of places hit by Ukrainian drones, not last night, but the night before. And then what do we have here? So this is a video of a drone hitting a gas reducing point and several substations in the Belgorod region. So you have just a general substation, energy in the middle of Belgrade, and you have this drone that just really slowly flies up to the gas pipeline just coming out this tiny little hut, and then touches it, and that's the end of that gas pipeline, as the drone just very slowly drives into it. Anyway, I don't need to show you that. By the way, just to let you know, it'll be relevant for what I'm going to say now. Actually, I don't know. Right, okay, let's start with weather. Or more accurately, climate. So I'm not a climate doomer, says David Helms, but it's fair to say that global record high temperatures is unfortunately the new normal. So it's the warmest June since records began in 1850, and it's the 13th consecutive record warm month. 12th at least 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So you've got El Nino and La Nina. You've got both hot and cold jet streams and whatnot, weather systems that can mean it should be, if it's really warm, it's going to be slightly warmer anyway because of, is it La Nina? But then El Nino was colder and it was still record-breaking warm. So it's overcoming the mitigation of El Nino. So either way, things are super warm. And by the way, solar flares and cosmological cycles do not explain this. I know lots of people who like to be climate deniers will deny this. The data's in, it's there. Go and do the research, and don't do research that has been funded by Chevron and ExxonMobil. Look at independent data. Feel the burn. Literally, the global heat wave smashing records every month for a year is probably the most underreported event in the media currently. And yeah, it's really difficult. And then that translates into both issues on the front line, but also with power, because everyone's needing air conditioning. I know that in Ukraine, they're really struggling with that at the moment. They're having rolling outages. But here's the thing, they're having rolling outages in Russia now. And there's some really interesting data points or arguments to throw into this. So meanwhile, Crimea is having a normal one. Electricity shutdown schedules have been introduced on the peninsula, including Alushta, Belogorsk, Yevpatoria, Kerch, Armyansk, Saki, Simferopol, Sudak, Feodosia, Yalta. The lights will alternately be turned off for 2 to 3 hours. The schedule's introduced due to abnormal heat and increased loads on the energy system of southern Russia following an emergency at the Rostov nuclear power plant. Then you have this. This is a really insightful, tongue-in-cheek, but super insightful thread from Andrew Perpetua. Imagine waging a war, so Russia waging a war against a country, Ukraine, that provides critical components of your electrical infrastructure. So before the war, Ukraine provided critical components to Russia's electrical infrastructure that provided energy for the country. But you are waging war on that country that provides that. And then pissing off their allies so much, European American allies, that they ban the export to your country of even more critical components of your electrical infrastructure. And then conscripting linemen and engineers who maintain your electrical infrastructure and then sending them to war so they die, and then targeting the electrical infrastructure in the other country, Ukraine, which makes them hit yours back. We've just seen a little gas place hit. We've seen loads of electrical substations be hit recently. But you can't repair things because you need the country you're at war with to produce the replacement parts for you. So then you look around at other countries still willing to do business with you, but none of them make the components that are compatible with your electric grid. And if you use their stuff, it would make the problem even worse. So you just stew in rolling power outages. Imagine if you were to do all of those things. Imagine if the war you started cost so much money that you had to cancel all future investments in the power infrastructure. So all the engineers who design and build power plants have to look to other countries for contracts. And then one of the sanctions aimed at hurting your ability to wage wars shut down the critical software these engineering firms require to do their job. So they all leave your country to build new headquarters in the countries giving them contracts. Imagine if after all that, random power plants in your own countries began failing and literally exploding. So we had 2 power plants over the last week, one of them a nuclear power plant, one of them a thermal power plant stopping working. And now we have a situation, if I go to my Twitter feed, I will show you this. It's not on, this is the stuff I had for you earlier, but in the car just now, I was seeing that actually there are protests on the streets of Krasnodar because Krasnodar no longer has energy at the moment, or there are these rolling blackouts. Here we go. So in the Russian city of Krasnodar, people have begun blocking roads because of power outage. They complain that they've been without light and water for over a day. Actually, some are saying for 3 days, I've heard. Police have begun detaining protesters in Krasnodar over power outages. They're detaining people on the streets. If this is what happens if you do clever strikes on infrastructure that causes locals to yes, you are causing harm for civilians here. They are not with power, but if they take this out on the Russian government, then this expedites the end of the war. Krasnodar, Russia. Locals come out today to protest power cuts. Multiple areas of the city have had no power since yesterday due to issues with the energy system caused by heat. Increased police presence is observed. I've heard that there have been some issues for 3 days now in certain areas. So that is happening, and that is, I think, really good news for the Ukrainians in terms of presenting discord and disharmony inside Russia. Okay, high-profile MP, a Ukrainian MP or former MP, has been shot and now has died in hospital. That's Irina Farion. She angered many in the military by saying all Ukrainian soldiers should speak Ukrainian, otherwise it's not an army but a rabble. Anyway, she's been assassinated, unfortunately. The man, it says, is still being searched for, but I think they might have found him now. I don't know who would have done this. Probably someone with pro-Russian sentiments or Russia themselves. But anyway, that's pretty terrible that a former MP has been assassinated in Ukraine. There's a water crisis to add to all the woes for Russia in Donetsk. In Rostov, again, someone accidentally switched off a pipeline, causing a pipe to burst, which stopped water flowing to Donetsk. Officials don't know how long it will take to repair or how long water reserves will last. It's all looking bad for the Russians in that respect. And then you've got this. So you've got trouble in Dagestani paradise. Mums complaining about what they describe as Wahhabi gangs, so these are sort of Muslim gangs, killing one of their sons for, quote, serving in the special military operation. Quote, they accuse that our sons are there with Russians. It is a haram to you, they said. You are helping the Russians. They came, 30 or 40 people, didn't even talk to my children. They shot at everyone. They hit them with irons. Then they all ran away. Where do I turn? Where do I go? So now you've got issues within certain republics, certain areas of regions of the Russian Federation, whereby some of the locals are having to go at other locals for supporting Russia's war effort by supplying them with troops. Absolutely fascinating. And this is, again, not good news for Russia. There is disharmony inside Russia. And if Ukraine can continue to hit key infrastructural points inside Russia and air bases, those two things together, then you could have Russia become a little more uneasy about this war, to understate it quite a lot. And also, and I'm going to talk about this later, although I don't know I'm going to have time to do any more videos later, but you've got Ukraine has shut off the oil to Hungary, right? And Hungary are really, really angry. And Ukraine are like, hey, welcome to the war, and you've been supporting Russia, so you ain't getting any of this, because you've got pipelines going through Ukraine that have been kept alive all throughout this war that have not been struck, because actually there's money changing hands and people need that oil. And Hungary have been sort of supportive of Ukraine, but as the war goes on, less and less supportive and more supportive of Russia. And it's evidently got to the point where Ukraine have gone, and screw you. You've gone to, this is Orban, you've gone to meet Zelensky in Kiev, and then taken that information and gone to Moscow to meet Putin, Beijing to meet Xi Jinping, and then Mar-a-Lago to feed it all back to Trump, and Trump's going to end this in a day by forcing us to negotiation. So screw you, Orban, and screw you, Hungary, and we're going to turn off this oil and then see how Hungary reacts and whether there's some leverage there that the Ukrainians have over the Hungarians. Really fascinating. So there's some things happening around the edges of the war, and I just fully expect Ukraine to be stockpiling we have not seen a large wave of drone attacks. I don't know how many we used last night, but I'm sure you're going to see air bases get targeted. There's nothing an airbase can do if it's got 100 attack drones swarming down on it. Yeah, you can have a couple of Pantsers set around there. You can have a few S300s, but it ain't gonna do anything to 100 drones taking out one place. And this is what I've said previously about Russia. Russia, when they've had their big drone swarms, they've kind of spread them out around Ukraine. I've never understood that. I'm like, I'd just pick one place and absolutely hammer the crap out of it, and then move to different places around Ukraine. 100 drones on that, 100 drones on that, 100 drones on that. Not like 50 drones sort of spread around Ukraine, so 10 on Kiev, 5 over there. Like that to me is like pointless. Yeah, you could be trying to work out where the air defense is, but it doesn't matter where the air defense is if you're going to send 100 drones at one place and completely take that place out. That's what I would do, and that's what. But I'm no expert, so whatever. But if I was Ukraine, I'd be doing that to Russia. Pick an airfield, 100 drones to smash that airfield. Now the problem with airfields though is that if they know drones are coming towards them, you scramble your pilots and get the planes up, and so you don't take out those planes necessarily, and that's why missiles are much more useful. It's things like the ATACMS that give you far less time to react. So ATAC, I don't know that you're going to be able to do damage to airframes that you would like to do, but you can certainly do damage to the air base infrastructure. So you can take out those oil depots there, and you can take out the air traffic control areas. So then it just becomes unusable somewhat. But yeah, we'll see what Ukraine do with their attack drones. I'd like to see them much more active. Anyway, that's enough from me. Big one this morning. Take care. Speak soon.